Why did God create war? Why does God create murder? Why does God create all the horrific things we see in the news, school shootings? Why would God create a mind that acts in that way?
Hello and welcome back to the channel. This particular video is going to be heavy in that it deals with the problem of evil. This is probably the single biggest objection to God being a good God, but there is a problem with the problem of evil. Tim Keller is going to begin to expose what that problem with the problem of evil is. I will further unpack it on the back end. One last disclaimer, I've seen a few other YouTubers recently cover this conversation and I thought that they did a fantastic job. I just want to add a little bit more context and sort of a philosophical lens through which to look at this extremely challenging, extremely important topic, the problem of evil. With that being said, let's dive in.
And at the end of 12 years of religious education, I was an atheist. And then I came to Columbia. The sticking point in all that regarding religion for me was the Holocaust. I looked at that and I said, how is it possible that 6 million people could be exterminated in the course of a war that took 80 million lives and there could be a God? How do you answer that question?
I'm going to push back and ask you, there sounds like there's two motives behind the question. Maybe they're both true for you. They're both very important questions. One is how could European civilization, which is based on Christianity for 1,000 years, produce something like that? Or was it much more general, and that is, how in the world could God allow that kind of evil and suffering?
That's the question I want.
The second one.
Yeah, the second one. Much more interesting.
Well, the first one is a terrible question, too. I mean, it's a terrible question to answer for a Christian minister. But as a pastor, I have to say that the Holocaust is awful, and yet as a pastor for the last 35 years, I've been sitting in rooms with people, as a pastor, with parents whose little, 2-year-old get run over by a car. I mean, it doesn't seem like a Holocaust, but it's the same kind of misery, the same question. Right. Why in the world would God allow evil and suffering? So I've been through it and through it and through it and through it. The right response to anyone who's actually in the middle of suffering is silence and love and speaking when spoken to. I actually don't believe it makes it any easier to handle or face suffering by disbelieving in God. And I actually do Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. He says, how do you know that a human deed is unjust, or a law? But he's talking about law, but how do you know a human law or deed is unjust? Only if there's a higher law that says it's unjust. Otherwise, what you've got out there is the strong eat the weak. That's how you and I got here. If there's no God, you and I came here through stronger organisms eating the weak organisms, natural selection. That's what life's about. That's utterly natural. Now, deep in our hearts, we feel, no, that's not right. But, the question is why? Now, what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying is, we believe that strong eating the weak is unjust and wrong because there's a higher law. If there was no higher law, he says, how do you even really justify your outrage?
And yet the strong eat the weak every single day.
Yes.
So why doesn't God intervene and say, you know what? You can't kill all those people. Stop it.
Well, I said there were two responses. The first response only is that it doesn't make it any easier. I mean, it really doesn't, because now, on what basis am I morally outraged? If strong eating the weak is natural, so what? So they did it. Stronger nations eat weaker nations, stronger individuals. So what's the big deal? What's the problem? I mean, that's fair. I mean, that's not a complete answer, but it's fair to say, yeah, now as an atheist, now how am I dealing with evil and suffering? Now I really have only a visceral reaction to it. I don't even have a real cogent warrant for saying this has absolutely got to stop, other than I don't like it. But the second is, now you were raised, you went to Catholic school. The Christian view of God is very different than the other views of God, because the Christian view of God is that God came into this world and suffered. Now, I have a cat, and my wife and I love our cat, and we actually saw it once. We broke its leg by accident. But we fixed it. for only $1,000, which we never in a million years would have thought we would ever do for a cat. But
Well, you broke it, so
we broke the cat.
you're kind of morally obligated.
And
in my
it
book.
suffered. However, I think it's fair to say, because it doesn't have the same kind of self-consciousness, I would say that a human being suffering is probably at least sort of some kind of higher order. You're more aware of things. There's more agony than a. If God really came to earth in Jesus Christ, and the suffering he went through on the cross voluntarily would have been far beyond my suffering. Now, what does that do? It does not. Even after you believe that God would have come down and become vulnerable to suffering and death, that does not yet give us an answer to the question of what the reason is that God allows evil and suffering. But it does tell us what the reason isn't. It can't be that he doesn't love us, or he wouldn't have come down and gotten involved. It can't be that he doesn't care, or he wouldn't be involved. I don't know what the reason is he hasn't stopped it yet, but it can't be it can't be a remoteness, it can't be indifference, or he wouldn't have come and gotten down involved. Now that assumes you believe the gospel. But if you believe the gospel, what it does is it keeps off the idea of indifference and says, I don't know why he hasn't stopped evil and suffering. But whatever the reason is, it can't just be indifference, hardness of heart, or lack of
Well,
love.
have you thought about it in terms of, the reason?
You mean actually trying to
Why didn't he come down and stop the Holocaust?
I don't know. But now,
All right.
at this point, you've got to ask yourself a question. If you can't think of a reason, does that mean there really can't be one? That's the Alvin Plantinga.
Right.
Have you heard the no-seeums? Oh, this is good. You'll like this. Okay.
Lay it on me.
All right. Well, now, you're an academic, so you realize philosophers talk like this. Neither of us are really philosophers, but you do know how they talk.
I do indeed.
Okay. He says, if you look into a pup tent and I ask you, do you see any St. Bernards? And if you don't see any St. Bernards, you say, no, I don't see any St. Bernards, then we can safely conclude there probably are no St. Bernards in the tent, because if there were a St. Bernard in the tent, you'd probably see it. But he said, if you look into a pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? Now, no-see-ums, if you live near the Great Lakes, are little gnats that are so small they come through the screen and bite you anyway. And he says, so if you look into the pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? And you say, no, I don't see any see-ums. I don't see any no-see-ums. That doesn't mean that there aren't any no-see-ums in there, because if there were, you couldn't see them. And he says, now, when you say, because I can't think of any good reason why God would continue to allow evil and suffering to happen, therefore there can't be one, you're assuming that whatever reasons there would be more like St. Bernard's than no-see-ums. Well, why should it be? I mean, he says this is probably cold comfort. Without the gospel of Jesus Christ coming into the earth and coming alongside of us, it's cold comfort. But what he's saying is you can't assume that just because you can't think of a good reason why God hasn't stopped it yet, there can't be any. And then the gospel says, well, whatever that reason would be, it can't be a lack of love.
When you say there's too much evil in this world, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's such thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. When you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral law giver, but that's who you're trying to disprove, not to prove. And so this is the interesting way in which, from a more philosophical perspective, the problem of evil actually exposes a reason for God. But at a more personal level, I love what Keller said here, that you don't necessarily just make a philosophical argument to sort of hand wave away something that is actually atrocious in the real world. You actually empathize with the pain and the suffering that exists, because it's not just a philosophical idea, it's real pain in the real world. And so I think that the emotions that suffering brings about are important. But again, this idea, and I love the way that John Lennox phrased this question, but what is Jesus doing up on that cross? If it's true that Jesus is God, what is he doing up on a cross? Why is he being tortured? Why is he suffering? Doesn't that point to the fact that God has gone into the business of solving the problem of evil, that he has gone into the business of dealing and contending with human evil? You, viewer of this video, might not fully understand his approach, but that's different than that he hasn't taken any approach at all. And I would extremely strongly encourage you to gaze into his approach and to try to understand what the gospel has to do with evil, because I'm telling you, there is a power inside of the gospel that when you understand it, it transforms not just your ideas about God, but it transforms you. There's something about understanding your Creator through the lens of his sacrifice for you in the person of Jesus that changes your life. When you see that the problem of evil is not a philosophical idea, but it's something that exists at the core of your own heart, and that it has been dealt with by God with love for you on the cross, that the shepherd has become the lamb, that the Creator has become a vessel of judgment so that you could be freed from this problem of evil, so that you could be yourself contended with and freed and forgiven from this problem of evil. Christ became guilty so that you could become innocent. Christ took on death so that you could be given eternal life. You are a part of the problem of evil, and so am I. And God has made an assessment of how to deal with it. Understand his assessment. Understand yourself in light of it, and be surprised by the effect that it has in your life. Don't just be a hearer of the word, be a doer of the word. Jesus is real, full of love, extremely powerful, and he has a destiny for your future that is more wonderful than you could possibly imagine. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks a lot for watching.